Today we're going to be fabricating two occlusal rim for an upper and a lower model, and materials and the tools you will need as follows: 2 sheets of light cure, 2 sheets of wax, a denture ruler, your scalpel with a handle, a seal cover, a separating brush, a toothbrush, a red pencil, font stock, rim former, Bunsen burner along with some wax, the alcohol torch, and Vaseline for separating medium. Here we have our maxillary stone model. The first thing we're going to do, we're going to analyze the model to make sure there are no discrepancies. Once we establish there are no discrepancies, we will mark our borders, which is the deepest part of the sulcus, and the posterior of the denture. We're going to go from hamular notch to a hamular notch, and we will mark the area of our pulse stem. Once we establish that, with the help of a seal carver, we will carve the pulse stem approximately 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter in depth. Using the air gun, remove any stone debris, put the model aside. We'll establish the same thing for the mandibular model, outlining the deepest part of the sulcus, which also serve as final denture border. After establishing our borders, we will use our separating medium, in this case Vaseline, to apply on the stone model, making sure all the areas are separated. In this particular case, we're not blocking out any undercuts. We'll explain more in class in regards to blocking out undercuts. Continue to do the same separating medium for the mandibular model. As both of our models are separated with a thin layer of Vaseline, we will then use a sheet of light cure base plate and adapt it well around the model, ensuring that the model is completely covered and the base plate is adapted well around the maxillary model. With the help of a scalpel handle, we will cut along the edge of the model. Using the Zale carver, adapt the edges of the base plate all the way down to the sulcus. And around the posterior edge. Adapting well into our pulse stab markings, making sure the light cure is fully adapted. We will put a model aside. We'll continue the same thing for our mandibular model. Cutting around the edge as we did for the maxillary model, ensuring to save some light cure material to be able to adapt well into the sulcus area. Again, with the help of our Zale carver, we'll go ahead and adapt the edges all the way to the sulcus. as you can see, I'm making sure that the light cure is fully adapted and not leaving any sharp edges, trying to round as much as I can at this point. It will serve me better later on when I'm trimming the edges. Save a lot of time at the trimming stage. Okay. Now we have our maxillary and our mandibular plates ready to cure and trim before we start applying the wax. Here we have our base plate cured and trimmed. Prior to starting the next step, we will inspect that there are no sharp edges. All the rounded areas are established, and we will notice that there are no interference in the freedom areas. We'll perhaps do the same thing on the lower model, making sure no rough areas that will eventually hurt the patient. And now we will start the fabrication process of the occlusal rim. Before that, we will inspect our model to look for the deepest part of sulcus, and on the maxillary model, our deepest part of sulcus established around in areas that are deepest, and we will establish a marking as our deepest part of sulcus. And this marking will come handy when we establish the occlusal height, which for maxillary occlusal rim, it's 22 millimeters. And you will find that information as a part of your rubrics and from the readings. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to grab a sheet of wax, and we will heat up the wax over the Bunsen burner until it's slightly softened, and we will roll the wax in folds until we establish that there are no air pockets trapped. And we'll continue this procedure until the whole wax sheet is rolled into a folded tightly with no air pockets. And we will continue this by going back and forth without folding a sheet of wax to ensure that the wax is still at a soft stage, which will help us manipulate the next step. We want the wax to be soft, not melted. As you can see, when the wax is heated uniformly, you will get a better result. And again, away from the camera right now, I am using the wax over the Bunsen burner flame to soften it. this stage, again, we want to keep ensuring that when we're folding the wax, that we're not trapping any air bubbles that will need to be filled later on. So in order to save us some time, we would take our time and meticulously fold the wax into the shape that we desire. As you can see, the wax is soft and I can mold into a U shape or a shape of the arch very easily. Again, with the help of the Bunsen burner and the flame, we will soften the wax. And once we establish the wax that it's at a certain temperature, or certain softness, I should say, then we can go ahead and adapt it onto our model. Now we have a model in front of us. We will go ahead and adapt it all around the base plate that we have created. Now, since we had roughened the surface of the base plate, it will help the wax to bond itself a lot easier. Once we established a boundary around the wax, we can go ahead and cut the posterior region. And with the help of our fond stock, we'll heat it up, the tips over the flame, and blend the wax from our wax roll onto the base plate. And at this time we have already Vaseline our models from the previous step, ensuring the wax will not adhere itself to the borders of the model. And if it does, we can always use a steam cleaner or water, a hot water in a kettle to clean our models. So once we have the outside edge, again, blending the wax again, our wax is still soft. This way we can go ahead and adapt it slightly more, just to the shape of our maxillary arch. We will continue to do that again for the lingual or the palatal side. As you can see, the wax is still soft, which is good. And we can look at it from every angle to make sure our rolled wax is directly on top of the ridge with slight protruded anteriorly. And we want to make sure that where our edge of the model is, that our wax is not depressed more towards the lingual or too far out buccal. Now we will use our ruler where we have established the deepest part of sulcus. From that area, we will measure the 22 millimeters. So maxillary anterior height is 22 millimeters, and in a 22 millimeters marking, you will see directly on your denture ruler. As once we have established the area, we will take our sail carver, or in this case, you can use your scalpel, anything sharp, and you will mark that 22 millimeters. So this is our 22 millimeter, and we will mark this area. As you can see. Again, we will make sure from the deepest part of sulcus, the anterior height is at 22 millimeters. Next thing what we're going to do is we will use our rim former. This is called a rim former, which will help us melt the wax into the shape and the height that we desire or we prefer. Prior to doing that, I recommend to use a wipe ball or a paper towel that we will put it on underneath your model, which will collect the wax that will be forming from the wax former. Our steps of fabrication will include using a rim former, and as you can see, the rim former is shaped in a way that we have the edges which will collect the wax. So what we will do is we will heat up the rim former over the Bunsen burner, and we will position the posterior of the rim former exactly aligned with the edge of our model, and we will press it in. So this step requires for the rim former to be hot, so safety consideration needs to be applied, making sure once we have our rim former heated up that we will avoid touching the plate itself. And our rim former gets really hot, as you can see, smoking hot. And once we know the rim former is heated up to the degree that we need, we will position it to the posterior pad, and we will melt the wax to the marking that we have established of a 22 millimeters. Once we reach that 22 millimeter marking, we will stop. As you can see, the wax residue and the melted wax is collected on the piece of paper towel that we had underneath our model, which will help us a lot with cleaning. Now, once we establish our height, we will safely put away our rim former as it is extremely hot. Now we can see our models. Our model with wax with a sharp edge. Wax is still soft. We can still form it the areas we need. If we have any residues of the wax on the model, we will go ahead at this time clean it slightly. And we'll wait the wax to cool for a few seconds. In the meantime, we'll have our wax sheet removed from the area. We wait for the wax to cool down slightly. While the wax is being cooled down, we will do our interior measurements. In the interior region, we would like our interior section to be between 4 to 6 millimeters. So we will go for the 6 millimeters in the interior region. So we will use our denture ruler again. And as you can see, the marking is here, the 6 millimeter mark. So we'll keep it 6 millimeter here. And then we'll do that the same thing for the posterior, which is approximately between 8 to 10. So on the posterior, we will go ahead and mark the 10 millimeter line. And we'll continue to do the same thing on the other side, the other quadrant. We mark the 10 millimeter line. We already have the 6. So between the 10 millimeter and the posterior, the maximum of 6 millimeter in the interior, we will go ahead and join and form those lines, which is basically the size of our final bite block or occlusal rim. Now we will use our font stock blade, and again our wax is pretty soft. We will go ahead and carve away that excess wax. Now this piece of excess wax, we will not discard it. We will put this extra wax onto our wax pot, which will come handy later on. Now as you can see, our occlusal rim, our bite block, almost ready to go. It's taking the shape. And now we finally will go ahead and work with the aesthetic aspect of it, which means filling up any gaps or voids for the presentation purposes. So again, we're going to go ahead and heat up our font stock over the Bunsen burner flame and just blend the wax. We will add a little bit more wax on the palatal area, just a wash of wax, which will give us a nice and shiny and smooth structure. We'll continue the same thing in the posterior, making sure we have our edges aligned. As you can see, when we had our occlusal rim posterior molded with a rim former, and we have established the posterior edges. So you can see from both sides that we have uniform angulation. Again, heating up our instrument over the Bunsen burner flame so we can blend the wax form a part of the wax that's not going to be rough. And for the presentation aspect, we want to make sure the wax is completely blended in. You can now use your Zale carver to lightly clean up or carve away any rough surfaces. And same thing on the buckle. And next step is, with the help of our toothbrush, we will clean the wax, making sure we don't have any wax residue. And then we'll do a final check again to make sure we are at the 22 millimeter from the deepest part of the sulcus from the anterior, and our anterior edges between 6 to 8, and you can see here we can trim a little bit more to bring it to 6. We have 10 millimeter in the posterior. We have 10 millimeter on both sides of the posterior region. We can go ahead and start trimming slightly more from the anterior section to ensure that we meet the criteria established. We are at that 6 millimeter marking. Using our font stock tip again, we will blend the wax in place, making sure that we don't have any area that's filled with air pockets. As you can see, this whole procedure that we started, we still have our models intact with the base, and we haven't removed anything of models yet, and we will discuss that in the next few minutes, why it's so important to make sure your model is intact with your base plate without removing until the final stages. Once we establish our borders, making sure all the areas are symmetrical and our wax is still soft, so we can go ahead and form the symmetry without doing any much of a carving. And we can see from the edge where our model lies. So we can bring the posterior slightly forward to give us a uniform edge. And now, in order to the final aesthetic work of blending the wax, we're going to use our alcohol torch. Our alcohol torch is filled with metal hydrate, and we will use the flame aspect of it, which is the tip right here, and to smooth our wax. So we're going to light the alcohol torch. Once we have the alcohol in place, we will discuss the safety features more in class. So once we have our flame lit, we will keep it in the vertical position, and by squeezing the bottle, we are creating a flame tip. So we'll use the flame tip to soften and to smooth our wax. And we do this in a very precise manner without generating too much heat, as we don't want our wax to fully melt. At this point, we just want to make sure the wax softening and it's blending everywhere. We'll continue doing the same thing for the occlusal and subsequently on the palatal side. The wax wash that we had formed earlier, now we will make sure the wax is blended in and our occlusal rim is nicely adapted onto the base. And this procedure takes time, and we would like to perform this meticulously without overpowering the alcohol torch with too much flame. Again, whenever you're using the alcohol torch, when the steps are done, making sure that blow out the flame. Again, safety consideration, keeping in mind the tip is pretty hot at this time, that you will avoid touching that area and away from your work area too. Next, once the wax is slightly softer, we will use our brush. We will make sure the wax is nice and clean. And then we'll do final adjustment of the measurements again. We'll look at the 6 millimeter, 10 millimeter, and a 10 millimeter. And that's the maximum. And we have 4 to 6, 8 to 10. Now at this stage, once we have established a good surface smoothness of our base plate, we can remove our model, and very precisely we would like to go ahead and blend the edges now. At this point we will make sure that we don't pour or we don't accidentally get any wax in the intaglio surface. So if we get any wax in the intaglio surface, it will alter the fit back onto our model. So we would make sure that we hold our occlusal rim away from the area the wax will flow in. Using the tip of the foam stock, we will blend it, those areas in. Again, around the edges. Avoiding any wax to go into the intaglio surface. Go back to the edge of the model. And now we will go back to our alcohol torch. Make sure all the corners are rounded and blended in. At this point we will work with the symmetry of our occlusal rim, making sure everywhere is symmetrical. And when the wax is slightly soft, it's a lot easier to work for the symmetry. And again, we'll go back to our wax brush and we'll keep it clean. And again, it's very important to keep one brush for wax and one for stone, so this way your wax brush itself will always be clean without any stone particles that you will eventually embed into your wax. And we always make sure prior to sending our occlusal rim to the clinician, for the clinician to have the bite registration taken. We will make sure everything is clean, free of stone particles and any premature wax in the intaglio surface. So this is our final bite. Before we do anything else, we will go ahead and let it rest so the wax itself will solidify. And once the wax is solidified, then we will rinse it with some soap and water along with our toothbrush or any flannel wax brushes that would help us get like a nice shine. But at this point, we will go ahead and have it set aside. We inspect from every corner to make sure our model is well adapted, and we do like a final check to make sure we have a nice fit to it. And this is a reason in this particular case I did not remove any of the undercuts. As I noticed on these ones, there are very little undercuts, but it will help us maintain a good stability on our base plate. Now we will set this aside. While it's cooling, we're going to start the same thing for our mandibular case. And again, for the mandibular case, prior to starting the wax roll procedure, we will go ahead and apply Vaseline, as it's been a few minutes past since we have applied the Vaseline on the model. And we will make sure that we separate those areas again with a very thin layer of Vaseline, which will help us. And once we have established that, we will go ahead and mark our retromolar pad. And on both sides, at this point, we are aware of where our retromolar pad lies. And once we establish our retromolar pad, we will go ahead and mark the 2/3 of our retromolar pad, which will be approximately in this region. And we will have that marking all the way out onto the edge of the model. And we'll do the same thing here. And what we'll do for the lower also is going to establish this center of our crest. And it is very important that we do this when we're fabricating our mandibular occlusal rim, as we would like to have the wax to be directly on the ridge, which we will explain in detail in class as we move forward with the fabrication steps. And again, in order to establish where the center of the crest is, we would make sure that we bring our model, we'll bring lines on the edge of the model, since once we have our base plate support on top, it will not be visible, the lines. And again, we'll do the same thing at the anterior stage. And also, we will establish the deepest part of sulcus for the mandibular occlusal rim. So we will establish just by visually inspecting the deepest part, and in this particular part, the deepest part of the anterior section lies in this area. So we will go ahead and mark arbitrarily in this area. And for mandibular occlusal rim, the height is 18 millimeters. So we don't necessarily have to write the number as we progress, but just in terms of the demo purposes and having an idea how many millimeters we will have for the lower, that is our deepest part of sulcus, and that will give us the 18 millimeters. So we will continue the same step that we did for the maxillary occlusal rim by folding the wax and forming onto our model. I'm going to start with waxing and with the same concept. I will pause the video at this point and go ahead and do the wax part, the folding of the wax, and come back once the wax is around it. We have our wax rolled up and have it shaped the size of our arch. As you can see, it is very soft and we can move it with ease, and we will make sure that our wax is soft enough so we will be able to adapt it over the model. We'll do the same thing that we did previously for the maxillary occlusal rim by adapting our wax onto the base and making sure that all the areas are adapted well. Again, we will go back with our font stock, heat it up over the Bunsen burner to heat up and blend the wax onto our base plate support. We continue to do the same step on the lingual. And we have established the marking of the millimeters, which was the 2/3 on this area and the 2/3 of retromolar pad. Highlight that area, which will come handy later on. Now, while the wax is still soft, we will go ahead and get the shape of our arch. And it's very crucial to make sure that the maxillary, that the mandibular occlusal rim lies directly on top of our ridge. And we will alter it later on once we establish the height, but it will be a lot easier just to be able to get the position when the wax is at the softest stage. Once we have established that, we will go ahead and do our markings for the height of our occlusal rim. As we established previously, from the deepest part of sulcus, we will mark 18 millimeters, and we can see from our denture ruler that where the 18 millimeters will mark. As you can see, the first line here has the demarcation for the 18 millimeters, which will do that, and then kind of give us a little bit more visibility by carving or by scoring that 18 millimeter line. Go back, ensure that you are at that 18 millimeter, and now we had that 2/3 of a retromolar pad exposed, so we will go ahead and carve away the extra remaining wax that we have in the posterior region, and likewise from the other quadrant. because that would be the edge of our occlusal rim for the mandibular. Now, as you can see, we have the line. We will go back and use our rim former, but prior to doing that, just to keep our area nice and clean, we will have a piece of paper towel to catch the wax remaining. And what we'll do for the lower, we will have the edge of our rim former at the demarcation line of the 2/3 of the retromolar pad. So on the mandibular, on the maxillary, we had the edge of the model, and on the mandibular, we will bring it slightly closer to the line that we have drawn, which is the 2/3 of the retromolar pad. And now we have our rim former heated up. We will put on the edge of the 2/3 of retromolar pad and bring it to the demarcation line of 18 millimeter. And once we do that, we will put away our rim former away from our working site to ensure safety. And at this point, the wax is still soft. We can go ahead and do our adjustment by just pushing the wax into the area to give us well adapted look, final look. We will remove any excess wax anywhere away from the 2/3 of the retromolar pad. And we can see the 2/3 of the retromolar pad will give us parallelism to our base of the model. And we will do this. We have done the same thing on the maxillary. As we can see, we have established parallelism between the base of our model and also the height and the edge of our maxillary occlusal rim. Now we'll let the wax cool down slightly before we go ahead and do the measurements. Okay, now once the wax is cooled slightly, we can go ahead to our measurement, which is the same thing as our maxillary aspect, 4 to 6 millimeter on the anterior section and 8 to 10 millimeter for the posterior. We will go ahead use a sharp instrument to do the marking of the 6 millimeter. And then subsequently in the posterior. So the region that we look for to do our marking of the 8 to 10 millimeter in the posterior, it's in the areas of where our 6 or 7s, the first molar and second molar would be placed eventually, which we'll discuss more in detail in class. So once we have established the 10 millimeters, we are going to go for the maximum the measurement, and then we will reduce from the lingual, and then we'll go back and adjust it later on when the wax is soft to make sure our bite block is directly in the center of our crest. So we have established the lines here, similar to the maxillary occlusal rim. We will go ahead and join the lines that will form the arch. Once we establish that, we can go ahead and use our sharp instrument, or perhaps the fawn stock, knife edge, and we can go ahead and cut away the excess wax. And carefully following the line that we have drawn, and now we have our excess wax. Again, with the same excess wax, we don't discard, we will reuse this wax as a part of our wax spot. So now we have established our borders and the size of our mandibular occlusal rim. As you can see, we have the wax itself is right in the center, and in this particular quadrant is slightly more buccal. So again, wax is soft, so we will make sure we push everything in to establish the center of our crest. Now we will move away the wax. Aside. Now we have our model. Now the wax is slightly cooled, we can go ahead and start doing the aesthetic aspect. Again, making sure that our measurements are intact and we have symmetry from both quadrants. First thing we want to do, we can use our Zale carver or any sharp instrument you prefer to establish a smooth wax edge by slightly carving away any rough areas prior to using the alcohol torch. And we make sure that we see the basis of our occlusal rim, and that we will go ahead and blend everything in with a heated instrument. Okay, we just want to use the wax that we have in our wax spot by applying a very thin layer of wax wash all in the areas of base plate that we don't have initial wax for coverage. This will ensure a smooth surface at the bite registration step in the clinic. And emphasize here is to make everything as nice and rounded. Again, if you notice areas are not symmetrical, we will go ahead and form those edges. So as you can see, our bite block for axillary and mandibular will start from 6 to 8 in the anterior and gradually increases to 8 to 10 in the posterior, forming the shape and the height that is given in your rubrics. Now clean up the wax. Then we will go ahead and use our alcohol torch again to ensure the wax is nicely blended, and for aesthetic reason we have a nice smooth finish. Make sure it's smooth here. Lingual areas. Again, we'll take our time when we're doing this step to ensure that we're not overheating the wax. We're just softening the wax so it can melt itself and form a nice homogeneous mixture with the rest of the wax. Now, as you can see, the wax is still soft, which is good. That gives us a final check to make sure we establish our height and our measurement. We'll just go back to our denture ruler to establish we have a 22, that's the 18 millimeter for the mandibular height, 6 to 8 on the anterior, and 8 to 10 in the posterior. So we can take out slightly from the anterior section. By pressing the wax, we kind of increase that edge. So we go back to give ourselves a nice finish, and then we will use our wax brush to ensure our wax is completely free from the areas that are protruded. And now at this stage, once the wax is cooled to our desired temperature, we can go ahead and use an instrument to clean any wax that are on the edge of the model. And then you can see here, we don't visualize, or we cannot see the edge of our model or the edge of our occlusal rim where we had the base. So we go ahead and we'll trim it away so we can establish the land area. And that's only because we have applied wax, and the excess wax that we melted can get into those areas. And again, we'll clean up, and then we do this once we remove our bite block from our model. But if you do it at this stage, you'll save yourself some time and avoid getting any wax in the intaglio surfaces, as we discussed earlier when we were fabricating the upper occlusal rim bite block. Now, we can go ahead and use an instrument to help with removing our base plate. So we'll find an edge here in the posterior perhaps, and then just dislodge. So now we have our model, which is pretty nice and clean, but we also have our bite block that no wax that are embedded in the intaglio surface. So just what we did on the maxillary occlusal rim, we will heat up our instrument by ensuring that we don't get any wax on the intaglio surface. We will go ahead and blend the edges of our occlusal rim. And again, we want to make sure all the edges are rounded and they're smooth. And if you get any wax here, slightly remove it. By holding our occlusal rim with the intaglio surface facing up, it allows us to form the edge, but any excess wax that will comes from blending will drop on the mat underneath, avoiding getting any wax in the intaglio surface. Again, it's very important to follow the step of ensuring no wax in the intaglio surface, as it will, as stated earlier, that will alter the fit and causes issues if we don't
clean it or remove any excess wax from the intaglio surface. So just, and in here, as the wax is still soft, we can go ahead and press everything into the edge of the model by again doing an edge check, which I call it, by running your fingers all around the models and the edges of it to ensure everything is nice and rounded. Now the next step is just by using our alcohol torch to blend everything into place for aesthetic reasons, and making sure everything is blended in completely and we don't have any areas that is going to be sharp or air pockets that we trapped. At this stage, we make sure wax is nice and smooth, and if we have any like air pockets, something like that, we go back with our heated instrument and we fill that pocket or blend everything in. We'll do the same thing on the edge of the model, and that will give us a nice finish for our bite block. And if we establish a little piece of wax here, we can blend it in, and again, we're not putting too much pressure, just very softly we're touching our heated instrument to establish that edge or any areas that have air pockets. Now we'll go back to our alcohol torch, just to the inside to maintain a nice finish. And very carefully have the edge of the models covered, protecting with your fingers. And again, safety consideration needs to be applied because we are working with open flame, that we ensure that we don't get any flame onto our fingers. We are directing the flame directly where the wax is, away from our fingers. Put away the alcohol torch once you're done, and we'll put our bite block back onto the model. And as you can see, we have the frenums open, and we'll just go ahead and do like a final brush to ensure everything is nice and smooth. Again, we will look for a symmetry. When the wax is soft, we can easily have the symmetry in, and in the back, we want to make sure we have everything is nice and defined. As you can see, we will define that area. Again, we want to ensure the model is parallel to our wax, so we can see from this angle. And again, if you got any wax on the model, that's fine. We will be rinsing and using the steamer or hot kettle, running water or boiling water, I should say, onto the stone model. So now we have our upper or maxillary. Now the wax has been set for a few minutes now. Everything is cooled. We can run our brushes again over it to ensure that we don't have any hard debris areas. Do the same thing on for the lower. Now we established our occlusal rim. This is our occlusal rim that we will go ahead and talk about it more in class, that the doctor will be taking the bite registration. As you can see, we established our 22 millimeter for the maxillary and 18 millimeter for the mandibular, which will give us our height, which is 40 millimeters. Now the next step we're going to do is we're going to let these bite blocks cool down slightly, and then we will wash it, rinse it with soap water and a brush, and clean our model, and we'll go ahead and we'll present it. Now we have our models nice and cleaned, steam cleaned, all the markings have been cleaned. Same for the mandibular model, and we have gone ahead and rinsed the bite blocks or the occlusal rims with soap water and a toothbrush to give a nice and shiny look to it. We could do a final check to make sure everything is stable, and do the same thing on the maxillary. You can see it's nice and blended, and the shine, and we have all the areas nice and smooth. And we have a good, do a little fet test where it's finishing, and then we have our bite block as a full set and ready for bite registration at the clinician requested time. Thank you for watching, and this concludes our fabrication of occlusal rim, or also known as bite blocks.